Hello everybody, this is week 2 of the NALA exam study group. Today I wanted to share the PowerPoint that I put together, and excuse any noise in the background. It's just, I live in a busy area, so because it's week 2, we're working on United States legal system. Today it's going to be a bit of an information overload, but I want to remind everybody that the main goal of the NALA Paralegal Knowledge exam is not learning definitions, it's being able to apply those definitions to real world scenarios. It's really about that application is what they're looking for. So I am going to briefly go through things. Of course, if you are planning on taking the NALA exam, I'm sure that you are either a paralegal or in the last 15 credits of your paralegal certification or whatever it may be. So I am going to maybe skim over a few parts, so I also wanted to say there's homework check. Last week's homework was to write down those areas of law and sort from most confident to least confident. So yeah, if you want to take a minute and share it or review it. I know this is more so for when I'm in the actual meeting, but all right, United States legal system info dump. Law, jurisdiction, and courts. Oh my. So, the types of law that we have. Number 1, constitutional law. I got my printed out packet of the United States Constitution right here. This is the law of the land, I'm sure, as you know. This comes before literally anything else, period. Number 2, statutory law. This is based off of U.S. codes, state codes, and municipal ordinances. These are enacted by legislative bodies, as I'm sure you know. Administrative law is next, so that is rules and regulations created by government agencies. Common law is based on judicial opinions, and it's built on the principle of stare decisis, which is the same thing as following precedents, basically. Developed through court decisions and precedents where past rulings guide future cases. Case law is the compilation of common law, the body of written judicial decisions that serve as precedent. So it kind of should just go under common law. It's not like its own separate thing, but yeah. Now, law subject matter, I'm sure you know, there's criminal law, civil law, and then underneath of that is contract law, tort law, property law, family law, labor and employment law. Yeah. There's also tax law, corporate and business law, environmental law, intellectual property law, immigration law, bankruptcy law, and I put international law. Those are all of the sources or what the sources of law which govern those decisions typically, but mainly you really need to focus on criminal and civil law, and civil law usually goes underneath. Like all of these are usually seen in civil law, however, it really depends. But there's also military law. This is different from criminal and civil law. I do mention later on that military law, while it's different from civil and criminal law, it is usually for things it's for things that are against the UCMJ, and in court, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person went against the UCMJ. Which is the same standard of proof, and we'll get into that. It's the same standard of proof as criminal courts. Maritime / admiralty law. This is water law, basically. And it's usually dealing with things of like commerce as well. And it is usually, there's, and then tribal law. This is for the legal system of Native American tribal nations, which have sovereign authority over their members and lands. Phew. Function of law, substantive law, which is from the Constitution, statutes, and common law, governs the original rights and obligations of individuals. The individual part is the most important thing. And procedural law is based on the Federal Rules of Criminal / Civil Procedure right here. And I also have the Rules of Evidence, but I don't want to pick it up. So provides how the business of the court is to be conducted. So just the functions, everything you need to know. It's all in here. And we'll get more into that as well. So there are a lot of terms and phrases regarding jurisdiction, but I would say the most important ones to pay attention to are subject matter jurisdiction as well as personal jurisdiction, which is on the next slide. However, jurisdiction overall is the authority for a court to hear a case. General jurisdiction is a court's authority to hear any type of case which is not vested in another court. Concurrent jurisdiction is when 2 or more courts have jurisdiction over a case, which means if like a state and the federal court both have jurisdiction over a case. Limited jurisdiction is when a court has authority to hear and decide cases only of a particular subject matter. All federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. This is because they are usually dealing with questions of the Constitution, or they have another set of criteria which must be met in order for there to be jurisdiction. Territorial jurisdiction is a court's authority to preside over legal proceedings in a geographical area. For example, if you commit a crime in California, you go to court in California. Appellate jurisdiction includes the power to reverse or modify a lower court's decision. So basically, when a court decision is made, if you believe there is a legal error, you can go to an appellate court. Of course, the court has to decide if they will take it, but yeah. So venue refers to the actual place and the actual specific court in which you go to. Like, for example, if I were to go commit a crime like in the area, like say I had a traffic violation or whatnot, I would go down to the county courthouse in Salisbury, Maryland. That's exactly where I'd go. So, yeah. Subject matter jurisdiction. This is super important. It governs which courts can hear which cases based on what the case is about. Federal subject matter jurisdiction includes diversity jurisdiction and federal question jurisdiction, which we are just now expanding on. So federal question jurisdiction is it means that a cause of action must arise under a federal law, so either the Constitution and or statutory requirements. Diversity jurisdiction is a form of concurrent jurisdiction. So for a court to exercise diversity jurisdiction, the amount in controversy must exceed $75,000 and complete diversity of citizenship must exist. Complete diversity of citizenship occurs when no plaintiff and defendant are domiciled in the same state. In determining whether this exists, a corporation is considered to be a citizen of both its state of incorporation and its principal place of business, which we will be expanding on because there are some very conflicting kind of definitions and things like that, which may get a little bit confusing. Minimal diversity is in class action lawsuits. Federal courts only need to meet these minimal requirements to govern multiple people. So basically it occurs when at least one plaintiff is a resident from a state that is different from at least one defendant. Class action lawsuits, I'm sure you know, are multiple people who are suing typically a company or whatnot. So yeah. Personal jurisdiction, it can be waived. Personal jurisdiction refers to the court's authority to issue a decision regarding the party being sued in a case. A party has to have minimum contacts with the forum to assert personal jurisdiction, which means they must either conduct business in the state, incorporate in the state, they must, if they visit the state, if they live in the state. For certain matters, the definition of where you live is different. So for example, for certain states, you may have to have lived in the state for a certain amount of time in order to be considered domiciled there, but it really depends on what type of law we're talking about. That would be for for like domestic relations, I'm pretty sure, but that's not necessarily personal jurisdiction. That's more so to be considered fully domiciled living in the state. But for personal jurisdiction, though, you know, the barrier's kind of low. Like if you even visit the state, then like the court can say we have power over you, especially if like the incident occurred in the state. But that is more of subject matter jurisdiction, I guess, or not. That's more of territorial jurisdiction. There we go. Sorry. Specific jurisdiction is a form of minimum contacts that enables a court to exercise personal jurisdiction over a corporate defendant in that state without violating due process because of the extent of the activities. We have an example there as well. And in personam jurisdiction is a court may exercise in personam jurisdiction of a person who resides in, means connections with, or is served notice of legal proceedings in the court's area of territorial jurisdiction. For example, a Delaware district court has in personam jurisdiction over citizens of Delaware, companies which do business in Delaware, and people who are served while visiting Delaware on vacation. Yeah, crazy. Imagine getting served on vacation, though. I'd be mad, but I digress. There's also these two forms I just wanted to talk about briefly. There's in rem jurisdiction, which means against the thing. It is a lawsuit against a thing rather than a person, which resolves rights or interests related to that thing. For example, in United States versus 422 casks of wine, the United States initiated a lawsuit against 422 casks of wine, claiming that it had the right to seize the casks because they had been deliberately mislabeled as sherry to avoid taxes. These cases are not super prevalent. You should probably know the definition of it, but these cases are all really kind of really old. The 422 casks of wine case, I believe, is from like the 1800s. I don't think this is a very popular doesn't happen often. There's also quasi in rem jurisdiction, which means as if against a thing. It is a legal action where a court uses a defendant's property within the state, such as land or bank accounts, to gain jurisdiction. It applies when personal jurisdiction over the owner is unavailable. The court's power is limited to the value of that specific property. Now we're going to talk about the U.S. court system. It's pretty simple, however, it can get pretty complex and confusing pretty fast as well. So, a tribunal is an adjudicatory body or court of justice. Fun little word to remember there. And the U.S. has a dual court system. So there's federal courts and there's state courts. Federal courts are dealing with constitutional issues, federal law, interstate disputes, everything that we just talked about in terms of jurisdiction, so you know what kind of courts there are. State courts are mostly criminal, family, contract, and property cases because it deals with state law. Most of the time, state law is what has jurisdiction over those areas because they have all their little different they have all their little different codes and everything like that. At least in my state, there's the Maryland code. I don't know if it's called something else for other states, but so for federal courts, there's the U.S. District Court. This is a trial court. There's 94 nationwide, and this is where cases start. From there, you have the appellate court, or the U.S. Court of Appeals. These are also called circuit courts. There are 13 circuits. I'll show you a map. Next slide. And when a case is appealed from a U.S. District Court, it goes to the Court of Appeals for that circuit. A case from Texas goes to the 5th Circuit. A case from California goes to the 9th Circuit, etc. And then above that is the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the very final federal court. It is at the very top. It is super big, and they can also decide which cases they decide to see and not see. Then for state courts, there are trial courts. These are sometimes also called circuit courts, depending on the state that you're in. For me, they're called circuit courts, but I know for other places it's not. I don't really understand. And then there's intermediate appellate courts, and then above that is the state Supreme Court. Here is a visualization of all of the circuits within the United States. So for me personally, I would be in circuit, the Third Circuit, basically. And here's also a map of the U.S. federal court system. We have, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court on top. There's the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces as well, and the Military Court of Criminal Appeals. And then there's also Veteran Appeals, Tax Court, District Courts. Mainly you want to focus on the District Courts, though, and then the Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. That's mainly the one that you're going to have to remember. Yeah. And here's also the Life of Appeal. I just wanted to include this because you're not going to have to remember everything, but like this was a really good description on how things go through the federal circuit court, basically. There's the notice of appeal, the appeal docketed, entry of appearance, certificate of interest, transcript order form. It's a big, long process, and there's many different layers on it. So I just wanted to provide this resource. Legal remedies. For civil cases, there are monetary damages. There are compensatory damages, there are punitive damages, and there are nominal damages. Compensatory damages are the most common form. The purpose of these damages in a civil case is to basically make the person, basically to compensate for whatever loss or to get a person back to their initial starting point before the incident occurred, if that makes any sense. For example, if I had $2,000 and I paid somebody to make a painting for me and they took my $2,000 and they didn't give me a painting, the court could either order for that to be completed or they could just give me my $2,000 back, because that was the original position I was in before the breach of contract. Of course, contract law is another thing entirely, which we will get into eventually. But so yeah, compensatory damages are the actual losses. Punitive damages are considered punishment and are typically awarded at the court's discretion when the defendant's behavior is found to be especially harmful. And then nominal or symbolic damages are usually not awarded very much. I would say punitive and nominal are both not awarded very much, but nominal damages are a small monetary award granted to a plaintiff whose legal right has been violated, but who has not suffered any actual measurable harm. Equitable relief, non-monetary forms of relief. There's injunctive relief, which forces a party to stop a specific action or compels them to perform a specific action. There's specific performance, which is the court order to fulfill a contract. There's rescission, which is canceling a contract. Or there's reformation, which is rewriting contracts. In criminal cases, there is restitution. This can be used interchangeably, I've noticed, like restitutive damages can be used interchangeably when talking about civil cases, but this is kind of what they refer to it usually as for criminal cases. So this is the monetary damages of a criminal court. For example, if you decide to burn a building down, you may be ordered to pay restitution. I also want to note, you probably won't need to remember this, but I want to note that there can sometimes be limits to restitution, especially for juveniles in the court system as well. It really depends. But yeah, and then non-monetary, of course, is jail or prison time, probation, fines, seizure of property, no contact orders, etc. Yes, we do need to talk about OJ. The reason I bring up OJ is because I want to talk about standard of proof and double jeopardy. So the most high-profile case of the 20th century is that of OJ Simpson, who was accused of murdering his ex-wife, Nicole Simpson, and Ron Goldman in 1994. He was acquitted in 1995 on all criminal charges. In 1997, the father of Ron Goldman, Fred Goldman, sued O.J. Simpson in civil court for wrongful death. Even though he was acquitted criminally, O.J. was found civilly liable for the wrongful deaths of both Ron and Nicole, and he was ordered to pay $33.5 million. When we think of double jeopardy, the concept of it is that you cannot be tried in court twice for the same crime. However, it does not apply when one case is criminal and one case is civil. And a lot of people ask, well, how come he wasn't guilty then, but then he had to pay money for wrongful death? and that is because of the standard of proof. In a civil case, the standard of proof is preponderance of the evidence, meaning that a court must be over 50% certain that the defendant is liable, because we're dealing with money here. In OJ's case, the court believed it was more likely than not that he was liable for wrongful death, but for criminal courts to find a defendant guilty, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning that a court must be 100% certain, like almost 100% certain. In OJ's case, there were doubts based on evidence and reason, and therefore he was acquitted. And of course, that is the photo of him trying on the gloves. I'm sure you all know the context to that, of course. So yeah, very interesting though, and it's a great way to kind of visualize standard of proof and double jeopardy as well. And double jeopardy is also based on the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, might I add. Also want to quickly add that burden of proof means that the prosecutor must provide evidence for criminal cases, whereas in civil cases, the plaintiff must be the one providing evidence. Fun time! I will be presenting 5 hypothetical legal scenarios, and your job is to tell me which court has jurisdiction over the case and why. Hypothetical legal scenario number 1. Sergeant Marcus Webb is an active duty U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Meade in Maryland. While on duty, he is accused of accepting bribes from a civilian contractor in exchange for providing the contractor with confidential information about upcoming military supply purchases. The scheme allowed the contractor to overbill the government by approximately $200,000 over 2 years. Which court or courts have jurisdiction over this offense and why? Hypothetical number 1 answer. There is concurrent jurisdiction because there is more than one court which can hear the case. The military court has jurisdiction because they can see cases over any violations of the UCMJ, such as accepting bribes and misuse of military position. Federal court also has jurisdiction. He had a plan to defraud the government, which is against federal statutes. I also want to note that usually in civil cases, there is that $75,000 federal diversity jurisdiction threshold, but that does not apply in this case because it is criminal. Just a reminder, just a reminder. Hypothetical legal scenario number 2. Patricia Nugent sued her former employer in Maryland Circuit Court for wrongful termination. The trial court ruled in favor of the employer. Patricia believes the judge made a serious legal error by allowing testimony that should have been excluded and gave the jury incorrect instructions. Which court has jurisdiction to hear her case and why? Hypothetical number 2 answer. Civil court is where the case would be filed because she's suing her former employer. Maryland Appellate Court has jurisdiction. Because the original case was in Maryland Circuit Court, it is a state issue. She is challenging an error in the case ruling. The original case has already been heard, so it cannot go back to its original jurisdiction. It's being appealed. Hypothetical legal scenario number 3. Devin Harris is accused of robbing a federally insured bank in Richmond, Virginia at gunpoint. He fled across state lines into North Carolina where he was arrested. North Carolina also wants to charge him with marijuana possession found during his arrest. Which court or courts have jurisdiction over each charge and which type of jurisdiction applies? Hypothetical number 3 answer. Firstly, this would go to criminal court because Devin has committed multiple crimes. Federal court has jurisdiction over the gunpoint robbery because gunpoint robbery is a federal crime. In addition to that, fleeing across state lines is another crime under the U.S. Code. Flight to avoid prosecution or giving testimony automatically creates a federal case. State court has jurisdiction over marijuana possession because it has subject matter jurisdiction as it is a state criminal offense, and territorial jurisdiction as the crime occurred in North Carolina or where he was found to be in possession of marijuana. I do want to mention that both states can prosecute Devon as he has committed 2 different crimes under 2 different sovereigns. However, this would not count as concurrent jurisdiction because it doesn't mean that 2 courts can deal with the same case. They both have their individual cases. Yeah. Sandra Kowalski lives in New Jersey and slips on a wet floor at a retail store during a trip to Pennsylvania. Her slip causes a severe back injury, resulting in $200,000 in damages. The retail chain is incorporated in Delaware with its principal place of business in Arkansas. Does federal court have jurisdiction? Does Pennsylvania state court have jurisdiction? Which court would you choose and why? So this would go to civil court because Sandra is suing a retail chain for damages, and federal and state court both have jurisdiction. There is diversity jurisdiction as Sandra is a resident of New Jersey and the retail chain is a citizen of Delaware and Arkansas. There is a subject matter jurisdiction of $200,000 in damages exceeds the $75,000 threshold. Pennsylvania also has territorial jurisdiction because the injury occurred in Pennsylvania, and the store operates in Pennsylvania, meaning that there are minimum contacts. That also means that there is concurrent jurisdiction, so both federal and Pennsylvania state court have authority. This confused the actual crap out of me for a second. I thought I was going crazy because in federal court, when it is a question of diversity jurisdiction, we consider the, in this case, retail chain to be a citizen of Delaware and Arkansas because those are where the business is incorporated and where the primary place of business is. However, when it's on a state level, the retail chain would have minimum contacts just by having a store in that state. So therefore, that state, that meets the certain requirements. So the requirements are different on different levels. I thought I was going crazy because I was like, well, surely wouldn't they have diversity? Like, why wouldn't they have diversity jurisdiction? Or why would they have diversity jurisdiction if the store is in this state? But that actually doesn't apply to the question being asked. A landlord and a tenant get into a dispute. Margaret, the tenant, lives in Connecticut and owns a valuable antique lamp. Her landlord, Robert, lives in New York while owning and operating property in Connecticut. Robert allegedly stole the lamp while she was on vacation. The lamp is worth $30,000. Robert claims the lamp was in the property before Margaret moved there and therefore belongs to him under a property agreement. Margaret wants to sue Robert and wants the lamp returned. Does federal court have jurisdiction? Does state court have jurisdiction? What type of jurisdiction applies to the claim for the lamp itself? Firstly, this would be in civil court because Margaret is suing Robert for damages. The state court has jurisdiction because Connecticut and New York have general and personal jurisdiction on both Robert and Margaret. Personal jurisdiction over Robert as he has lived in New York and met the minimum contact requirements for Connecticut. So therefore he has visited and conducts business in both the states. So why not federal? Parties are from 2 different states, but the lamp is only $30,000 and does not meet the $75,000 threshold needed for diversity jurisdiction. There's also no federal question jurisdiction because this is regarding property law and landlord-tenant law, which is primarily developed by state law. Questions? I'll wait. Homework. Based on where you currently live, identify the federal courts with jurisdiction over your area. Answer the following questions. What is the name and number of the U.S. District Court that has jurisdiction over your county? How many counties fall under that district court's jurisdiction? Which numbered U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals includes your state? If your case were appealed, which state would that circuit court be located in? Be prepared with your response for next week.